Hi, everybody. My name is Brad Kelly, and I'm the regional coordinator for the Society of Biblical Literature's Pacific Coast region. And I'm excited to welcome you to this installment of this year's SBL Pacific Coast Regional Meeting that we're calling K-Ray and Kativ, Read and Written. Obviously, things are a little different with the pandemic this year, so some of our papers are coming to you as video recordings. And I'm excited about this paper. Today we have a paper by Dr. William Horst from Fuller Theological Seminary. And this paper is from our program unit entitled New Testament Epistles and Apocalypse. And so the format will be, the paper will go for 20 minutes. And then at the end of that time, the chairperson of that program unit, Dr. Ken Waters, will come on and interact a little bit with our presenter to wrap things up. So without further delay, let me turn it over to William Horst. The title of his paper is The Glorification of God, an Objective Genitive Construction in Romans 1:23 and 3:23. Bill, if you would, please.
Thank you. I'll just bring up my PowerPoint quickly and we'll get started. Looks like I've got it. Okay. The language of glory occurs frequently in Romans. Exegetes commonly understand two particular verses as allusions to Jewish traditions about a fall of Adam and Eve from a glorious, immortal state into an existence characterized by corruption and mortality. Paul says that sinful humans exchanged the glory of the immortal God for a likeness of an image of a mortal human being and birds and four-footed animals and reptiles, and that everyone has sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. Both verses include a form of doxa, glory, modified by the genitive theou, of God. According to the Adamic interpretation, glory is a property humans potentially possess, and the genitive modifier specifies that this glory is divine. At the 2018 installment of this conference, I presented a paper in which I argued that the exchange of glory for idols in Romans 1:23 is best understood as an evocation of biblical traditions related to the golden calf of Exodus. However, as I continued to develop my argument, I became convinced that a different interpretation fits the book of Romans and the particular passages in question still better. In this paper, I will argue that Paul's references to the glory of God in the early chapters of Romans are best understood as objective genitive constructions that refer to the glorification of God through worship, that is, honor, praise, and obedience. Humans turned away from glorifying God and chose instead to worship idols, which caused God to give humans over to sinful desires, resulting in further behavior that does not glorify God. As a result, Jews and Gentiles alike find themselves in a state of failure with respect to the rightful task of glorifying God. So, in the early chapters of Romans, human deficiency with respect to divine glory has to do with a failure to worship God properly. The language of glory appears in Romans in various ways. Although scholars differ in their interpretations of specific passages, it is virtually uncontroversial that, on the one hand, at least some instances pertain to human glorification of God, and on the other hand, at least some instances refer to an eschatological blessing that God bestows on the elect. In other words, Paul makes God both the subject and object of glorification in Romans. Regarding the particular comments about the absence of God's glory among humans in Romans 1:23 and 3:23, the question is, should these instances be categorized with the glorification verses, the eschatological blessing verses, or in some other way? Worship is a key theme in Romans. At the outset of Paul's discourse, he describes sinful humans turning away from God to idols. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creation in place of the Creator. Because disobedient humans were unwilling to give God the proper glory, God gave them over to dishonorable passions, which resulted in various vices. The root cause of humanity's moral failings, as Paul articulates it here anyway, is a matter of misdirected devotion. Sin is fundamentally a rejection of God's lordship. Nijay K. Gupta argues persuasively that even earlier in the letter, Paul begins to distinguish himself subtly as a faithful worshiper in contrast to disobedient humanity in general. This is evident based on linguistic connections between the proem of Romans and the subsequent section in which Paul describes human idolatry and the resultant moral depravity. Paul states that he serves God in his spirit, whereas idolatrous humans serve created beings. Both assertions employ the verb latreuo, which connotes worshipful service. Additionally, Paul gives thanks to God in his proem, whereas idolatrous humans did not see fit to give thanks to God, despite having good reason to do so. Paul states further that he is not ashamed of the gospel, whereas idolatrous humans began to commit shameful sexual acts. These contrasts suggest that Paul is making a deliberate comparison between himself, as someone who worships God and behaves uprightly, and the idolatrous humans he goes on to describe. From virtually the beginning of this letter, worship is a significant concern. Beverly Gaventa shows that worshipful devotion to God, specifically as it is expressed in speech, is an important thread running through Romans. Paul's portrayal of human moral decline includes an exchange of proper for improper speech. Disoriented humans failed to give glory or thanks to God, but did come to engage in gossip, slander, and boasting, among other vicious behaviors. The catena of biblical quotations Paul uses to show that Jews and Greeks are under the power of sin also makes several references to a pervasive, toxic use of the body parts involved in speech. Their throat is an open grave, their tongues deceive, asps' poison is under their lips, their mouth is full of cursing and bitterness, which underscores that ungodly speech is a significant factor in human immorality. Paul's description of redeemed devotion in Christ also highlights the importance of speech. The primary evidence that the Romans have received a spirit of adoption is the fact that they cry, Abba, Father. Salvation is expressed in confessing with one's lips that Jesus is Lord. Further, Paul exhorts believers to live in harmony so that they might glorify God with one mouth. All of this amounts to what Gaventa calls an eschatological redemption of human speech. But in Christ, they are reoriented toward God, and proper doxological speech is restored. Lost my place. Centrally into the articulation of plight and solution in Romans. This emphasis on the glorification of God bolsters the notion that Paul's references to the glory of God in my passages of interest pertain to humanity's failure to glorify God in worshipful obedience, a failure that is rectified by the spread of the gospel. In Romans 1:23, Paul describes the turn of unrighteous humans from the glory of God to idols. The key arguments in favor of interpreting this exchange of glory as a forfeiture of Adamic immortality are as follows. First, the passage evokes the biblical account of creation in various ways, which supports finding an echo of Adam in the same text. Second, the fact that the glory of God is exchanged for an image suggests that humanity's trading away of the glory of God constitutes a giving up of the image of God in favor of a lesser mortal human image. Third, various Jewish writings evidence a widespread tradition about a primordial immortal glory of Adam and Eve that they lost through disobedience. Fourth, Paul states elsewhere in Romans that sin and death entered the world through Adam's transgression, which would cohere with the claim earlier in the same letter that humans exchanged the glorious immortal image of God for a mortal image. However, on closer inspection, this argument does not hold up as well as is normally assumed. Paul's description of idolatry certainly includes evocations of creation. He makes a clear contrast between God the Creator, who deserves worship, and creatures like mortal humans who do not. Further, God's invisible attributes are said to be discernible through what God has made. The propriety of devotion to God is predicated on God being the Creator. So that checks out. Paul's description of idolatry also evokes biblical traditions related to the golden calf of Exodus. Paul's assertion that they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the likeness of an image resembles descriptions of from the Septuagint of Israel's idolatry in general and the golden calf in particular. Speaking of the Israelites at Sinai, Psalm 106 reads, "They exchanged their glory for the likeness of a calf that eats grass." Romans and this psalm share the notion that people who ought to have worshipped the Creator God exchanged the glory associated with this worship relationship for the likeness of one or more natural animals. The similarity between the two passages is clear, and even scholars who argue that this passage of Romans is primarily evocative of Eden typically acknowledge that the parallel to Psalm 106 is also present. A key argument in favor of an echo of Genesis in Romans is parallelism between Paul's list of objects of idolatry and the categories of creatures found in Genesis 1:26. Parallels can certainly be found, but as I argued in my 2018 paper, another passage from the golden calf tradition has similar points of contact with Romans and some additional commonalities. In Deuteronomy, Moses cautions the Israelites against falling back into idolatry as they did at Sinai. Guard your souls carefully, for you saw no likeness on the day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb on the mountain from the midst of the fire, so that you may not transgress and make for yourselves a carved likeness, any image, whether the likeness of a man or woman, the likeness of any cattle that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies under heaven, the likeness of any reptile that creeps on the ground, or the likeness of any fish, any that are in the waters under the earth. Moses' warning shares with Romans the common vocabulary of image, likeness, and reptiles, as well as references, albeit with differing vocabulary, to humans, land animals, and birds. Like the creation of humans in Genesis, then, Moses' warning about idolatry has substantial overlap with the list of categories of idols in Romans. Moses' warning is also congenial to Paul's passage because it refers to Israelite idolatry at Sinai and thus coheres nicely with Paul's clear echo of Psalm 106. Further, whereas Genesis makes humans the pinnacle of God's terrestrial creations, the bearers of the bearers of the divine image, in Deuteronomy they are among the potential categories of idols, as is also true of Romans. Because Moses' warning against idolatry is fundamentally a caution against repeating the error of Sinai, the congeniality between Moses' list of potential categories of idols and Paul's list further underscores the importance of the echo of Israel's idolatry with the golden calf at Sinai in the same Pauline passage. The echo of Moses' caution about idolatry undermines a common scholarly argument in favor of an Adamic background to the passage, because Moses' use of both image and likeness in reference to idols as objects of worship suggests that image in Romans likewise refers to idols used in worship, i.e. graven images, not to the image of God in which humanity is created. In other words, the exchange in question is an exchange of objects of worship, not a transformation from the glorious imago Dei to a deficient lesser ontological pattern. It is true that Paul consistently uses a cone in reference to conformity to the pattern or image of God or Christ in a manner that clearly does evoke Genesis. But a divergence from normal Pauline usage is explicable by the fact that the word is here part of a literary echo of Deuteronomy, not a sentence that Paul composed from scratch. The case for an Adamic echo in Paul's description of the exchange of God's glory for idols is further undermined by weaknesses in the argument from Jewish literary tradition. Many of the relevant sources are significantly later than Romans and do not reliably reflect Paul's milieu. Among texts of the Second Temple period, few attribute glory to Adam, and for those that do, it is far from clear that glory is a property Adam possessed and then forfeited. For example, scholars often appeal to several references among the Dead Sea Scrolls to the restoration of all the glory of Adam as an indication that the Qumran community believed that Adam had forfeited a primordial glory that would be restored to the elect eschatologically. However, these references are ambiguous in their meaning because the lexeme Adam can refer to the original human or to humanity in general. For instance, when describing God's eschatological blessing of the elect, the rule of community says that the upright God has chosen for an everlasting covenant, and to them shall belong all the glory of Adam. This passage could mean that, among other blessings, the elect will inherit all the glory of humanity, or that they will inherit all the glory of Adam. If the phrase has the sense all the glory of humanity, the notion expressed may well be similar to the eschatological image in Revelation, where the kings of the earth bring their glory into the New Jerusalem. In other words, the phrase may point to the idea of the future rule of God's people over the nations of the world and the eschatological reversal of their fortunes. This and the other texts that contain this phrase do not provide much context for exactly what this eschatological glory entails, and it is certainly not a given that the phrase must refer to the first human. So we ought to exercise caution not to rely too heavily on the Dead Sea Scrolls for evidence of a tradition of the forfeiture of Adam's immortal glory. Apocalypse of Moses does clearly refer to the loss of divine glory through Adam and Eve, but because of the uncertain date and provenance of the text, it should not be regarded as a strong witness to a tradition in Paul's context. Further, in contrast to Romans, idolatry is not an explicit concern. Rather, after their trespass, Adam and Eve show creaturely submission in all their interactions with God, including the offering of an acceptable sacrifice. This is hardly the sort of turning from God that Paul describes. In similar ways, other texts commonly appealed to can be easily problematized. And I give you a thick footnote here with additional discussion. Suffice it to say, it is possible that Paul was aware of a tradition that Adam and Eve forfeited immortal glory by their transgression in Eden, but the evidence is really quite flimsy. Such a notion should only be posited of Romans on the basis of clear exegetical evidence, and I do not see this evidence in the text. Although Paul does talk about sin and death entering the world through Adam in Romans 5, and Paul's earlier comments about the exchange of glory can potentially be interpreted along similar lines, it is telling that Paul's explicit Adamic material never mentions glory, despite glory being such a prominent theme in Romans generally. In this and other ways, the passage of Romans that has the most clearly to do with Adam does not provide much support for claims in favor of an Adamic interpretation of the exchange of glory for idols. And again, I give you some more detail in footnotes. So that one's questionable. So then, the case in favor of an Adamic interpretation of Romans 1:23 is fairly weak. By contrast, several good reasons can be found to interpret the glory of the immortal God in this passage in reference to the glorification of God. First, the preceding sentence describes idolatrous humans' failure as a failure to glorify God. Although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or give him thanks. Given that Paul here uses the verb doxazo to describe humans' failure to worship God, it should be difficult for an attentive reader not to hear the cognate noun doxa in the next sentence in reference to worship as well. Thus, the glory of the immortal God reads readily as the glorification of the immortal God. This is supported further by the echoes I have already discussed of biblical passages pertaining to Israel's idolatry, since these intertexts have precisely to do with the neglect of proper worship and the pursuit of improper worship. Additionally, another occurrence of exchange in Paul's account of idolatry parallels the exchange of glory for idols. Paul says that misguided humans exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creation in lieu of the Creator. This second exchange has to do with replacing the truth about God for falsehood, but the false understanding clearly leads to worship of the wrong object of devotion. This exchange clearly involves the abandonment of true behavior, i.e., worship of the true supreme God, for false behavior, i.e., worship of inferior creatures. The exchange of God's glory for idols can readily be understood along the same lines, as an exchange of the true mode of glorification for a false mode that does not reflect the rightful relationship between creature and creator. So then, several elements of the immediate context of this first instance of the phrase, the glory of God, support an interpretation that makes God the object of glorification. The importance of worship in Paul's articulation of human plight and redemption in Romans, which I discussed earlier, only adds to the plausibility of this reading within the larger context of the letter. The interpretation of the glory of God in Romans 3:23 should follow from the interpretation of the parallel phrase in verse 1:23. This is because Paul's claim that everyone has sinned and all fall short of the glory of God essentially recapitulates the description of universal human plight established in the previous section of the letter. The claim falls within a discussion of the revelation of God's righteousness through Christ and connects the universal human plight of sin with the universal solution of justification through Christ. The point is, Jews and Gentiles alike are guilty of sin, as Paul has already established, so both groups alike are justified as a gracious gift. If we take the glory of God in Romans 1:23 to allude to the failure of sinful humans to glorify God rightly, then a straightforward interpretation of the claim that all humans fall short of the glory of God should likewise understand the glory of God as the glorification befitting the Creator God. If we do not find an Adamic echo in the earlier exchange of glory for idols, there is no apparent reason to find such a loss of glory in this subsequent reference to humans falling short of the glory of God. So then, I contend that Paul's statements about the absence of God's glory among humans do not imagine a lost immortal glory once possessed by Adam and Eve, but forfeited when they ate the forbidden fruit. Rather, these assertions are best understood to include objective genitive constructions in which God is the object of glorification. This further underscores the importance of worship in how Paul constructs human plight and the solution to that plight in Romans, and has at least two further implications as well. First, it undermines the notion that humans do not currently possess the image of God in a full way, which some claim is stated in Romans. Second, it implies that in these passages, Paul does not describe the inception of human mortality, since the glory of God does not signify a property of God, but rather the act of glorifying God. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bill, very much for that paper. Let me, at this point, go ahead and bring in Dr. Ken Waters to engage a little bit here. Ken, if you would, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bill, for this intriguing paper. Let me just ask you if you would say more about why you see a consistent understanding of doxa between Romans 1:23 and 3:23. Why not a shift in meaning of that term from an exchange of image to an exchange in the object of
Right.
worship? Why would you insist upon consistency there?
I don't know if I want to say I insist upon it, but I don't see, number one, I don't see a particularly compelling reason to think that there's a shift between verse 123 and verse 323. Furthermore, the way that verse 323 lands in Paul's argumentation, it seems to be recapitulating the plight that he has already laid out in essentially in Romans 1 or Romans 1 and 2. So I don't see, in the absence of some further, it's not, the passage in Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, isn't introduced, it doesn't appear to be introducing a new idea. It's something that is thrown in the context of talking about justification and justification being a free gift for both Jews and Gentiles. So it, again, I can't prove that it definitely means the same thing, but I don't know why I shouldn't see it that way, because it appears to recapitulate what was already stated and uses this same phrase. And so what context do I have for the glory of God, except for this earlier reference a couple of chapters earlier? I haven't seen compelling argumentation why I should treat 323 differently. And so it makes sense to me that the default should be to look back to the similar statement that already occurred.
Okay. Well, I'm interested in your change of mind. I think you indicated in a previous study that you held to an academic interpretation of doxa, but in your continuing study, a shift in your understanding occurred. Can you just kind of fill us in on that process that led to your change of understanding?
Sure, absolutely. And it's actually the shift from the paper that I presented a few years ago at this conference was actually arguing for glory being best understood in the context of the Exodus tradition. So God's glory being among the people of God, or in some passages, in say Ezekiel, God's glory departs the temple, indicating that God is not with his people in the same way, or something like that. That's the thread of tradition that I was arguing we should find in the text. So I should start by saying this is a brief adapted version of one of my dissertation chapters. If people have access to, I assume everyone can see it on ProQuest if they want to, if you want to see the full argument there. But it was the first dissertation chapter that I wrote way back, probably in 2015 at this point. It was quite a while ago. And I knew that I was not persuaded by what I see as basically the majority reading, the Adamic interpretation of the verse of Romans 1:23. I was not persuaded that Adam was there, or at least that it was referring to mortality. And as I was doing my research, I saw, well, okay, what's my positive claim? I don't just want to say it's not this. I want to say something about what the passage does mean. And I could see arguments in favor of either going in the direction of it means the glorification of God, what I've essentially argued here, and attaching it more to how glory works in passages related to the Exodus in general. And of course, because there is a pretty widely acknowledged, pretty much universally acknowledged echo of Psalm 106, which discusses the golden calf, I felt like it made more sense to go that route when I wrote the paper initially, when I wrote the chapter. So I did a bunch of stuff with that, and then moved on. My advisor gave me feedback, which I ignored for a couple of years because I was doing other stuff. And then when I came back to do a revision, I found myself, as I was trying, basically I was asked, well, why this and not this? And I found myself having to argue something and sort of reaching, it felt like, more and more to persuade the reader of something that I started to realize maybe I didn't actually feel persuaded of myself. It was hard to connect the dots strongly enough. And so at some point I reached a breaking point. I said, maybe I should think about what, if I go the other route, the other way I was considering going with my argument, would that work better? And so I basically, got scratch paper and kind of wrote down some things, and felt relief because I felt like I could make that case more persuasively. It always bothered me that doxazo means glorification of God in the preceding sentence. And so I kind of had to pretend I didn't know that, or try to deprecate that in some way, and when I was arguing for an Exodus kind of context to the passage. And so it felt better. It felt more straightforward. It felt like the argument was simpler. And then another factor here is in 2015, where I wrote the initial paper, and I don't know what year it was, it might have been 2018 that I actually revised it. Several people published essays that, a couple people, and I think I have footnotes for all this in the paper,
sure,
if people want to go look. A few pieces came out arguing something along the lines of what I was trying to say about glory in Romans that I found unpersuasive. And then some other material was published about worship in Romans that further suggested to me, I think it really may well be that, I should be paying more attention to how worship works in the discussion of plight and solution in Romans. So new scholarship, plus already it was gnawing on me a little bit. So I pretty much rewrote the whole chapter. There aren't very many sentences in the current chapter, the finished dissertation chapter that were in the first draft. It was quite an undertaking, but I did feel a lot better about the argument, and I felt more persuaded by my own argumentation by the time I was done. So I thought I would share that here too, since I had changed my mind.
Good. Well,
intriguing study. Thank you.
Possibly a model of what good scholarship should be, the ability to revisit one's previous conclusions and change them as need be. So thank you for that. Yes, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Ken. And thank all of you for tuning in, and hope you will enjoy the video and the paper, and catch some more as the SBL unusual Pac Coast regional meeting for this year carries on. Until then, take good care, everyone.